Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session on day 3 of Build. I'm Marina Smith. I'll be helping out hosting this session. This session is Mapping the Vote, Building a Scalable Public Map for Singapore's General Election 2025. And we are joined by our speaker, Foong, from the Open Government Products team at data.gov.sg. And before we get started, just a few logistical notes. So if you've joined Build sessions already so far this week, you know they're all being recorded and they are available to view after the event on demand. We will try to save some time for live questions in this session, so please do feel welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you would like to turn on captions or translations, that is available at the bottom of your Zoom window. And discover the recording for this session and all other Build sessions in the Zoom event lobby or at mapbox.com/build. So that's all the logistical notes from me. With that, I will welcome our presenter, Foong, to the virtual stage.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Marina, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks, everyone, for joining today. So a quick introduction about myself. I'm Foong. I'm the product manager for DataGov Singapore. We are Singapore's open data portal. You can find us at data.gov.sg. So really, we spend a lot of our time working with government agencies and sharing government data to the public. So today's session is going to be really focused around one instance of what we've done, where we've leveraged Mapbox pretty intensively, and kind of like the entire process, just all the learnings from a product standpoint, from inception all the way to production. So what is DataGov, right? So a little bit of context. Getting government data is really hard in Singapore, but I'm sure, I've also spoken with a lot of our counterparts in everywhere around the world, and this is a universal truth. And there's a couple of problems, right? Ultimately, there are asymmetrical incentives for data producers who mostly incur the cost of data collection and data cleaning and maintaining that data. And ultimately, sharing the data often starts off with a lot of good intentions, but runs into typical problems with marketplace dynamics, right? So with most open data platforms, or data marketplaces, there is a challenge of the co-stop problem, where first you have to find the data sets that people want, and in order to get that onboarded, you need to get people in as well, or demand in as well. And being able to match supply and demand is fundamentally quite a challenging problem. So this is something that we work on pretty much on a day-to-day basis, and we're very, very happy to share more outside of this session if anyone is interested to understand more about setting up their own data marketplaces and so on. So our mission really is to make government data discoverable, understandable, and usable. A lot of this kind of aligns with what Mapbox is doing in terms of making geospatial data really accessible to users. So this is a couple of examples of projects that we've done. Real estate data, things around weather, and then also things around businesses where we help with business registries and so on and so forth. So this is just a little bit of the metrics. So why did we decide to go from that to visualizing the elections, right? Honestly, there were a couple of problems that we noticed. Firstly, in Singapore, we realized voters couldn't really understand electoral data very easily. We also noticed that a couple of media agencies lacked the resources to make the data accessible. And finally, ELD, which is the elections department in Singapore, was mainly focused on the operational side of things to ensure the elections are objective and fair, right? So Singapore is a pretty small country, and compared to maybe a much larger country like the US, most of the media agencies tend to be a lot smaller and didn't have the resources to build a lot of these beautiful visualizations and interactives to help voters understand data around their own constituencies, historical elections, and how these things have changed over time. So it kind of started off as a general idea when we were watching the US elections, and we were thinking, hey, why can't we do this in Singapore as well? And then we started to think about what we could potentially do. So I did what most product managers would do. I wrote a PRD. But most people couldn't really understand this. They didn't really understand why we were trying to do this. So as a product manager, I did what I thought was the best, and I just PR'd it a lot harder. So I just took in a lot more examples and did a lot more research and all of this. But still, it was quite difficult to get all the stakeholders aligned. It was difficult to convince the elections department that this was worth doing. It was difficult to convince media agencies that this is something that was meaningful to do. And of course, there's like figuring out some of the trust issues where it's like, some random guys coming in and telling them, hey, this is like an interesting project that we can take a look at. So I kind of like changed tactics and decided like, hey, let's build a quick prototype instead, and showed this prototype to a bunch of different media agencies. And that's when things started to click a little bit, right? Because people started to realize instead of looking at a document, like a 20-page document, trying to explain like why they should be doing this, they were able to kind of touch and feel a map and interact with the data in a very visual manner. So you can see over here, this is like a very quick and dirty map with like an overlay of the electoral boundaries in Singapore. It's a very small country, but each of these are like various boundaries. And then you can see over here, like with mapped some basic colors to show like the winning margins and so on. So already with this, like what I thought was a pretty janky map, we were able to get a lot of great feedback from voters and from media agencies, journalists around like what they were trying to do, what their use cases were like, and how they would like to ideally visualize the elections for the 2025 elections that happened earlier this year. We continue to iterate on this after getting all this feedback, making sure it's like a little bit better and so on and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit about like our entire design process, and then a little bit about the engineering side of things, and finally like some of our lessons that we learned throughout this entire process. So I talked a little bit about the problems here, and in the beginning, these problems were not very clear. It took a little bit of time for us to understand our users well. And normally, when you start a project from scratch, a big part of the job or the big part of it is figuring out who's actually going to benefit from what you're going to build. And the big part about that is actually speaking to the users, right? And this is probably the most scary part about the entire process, because most of the times you're like, okay, this is just an idea. I don't know who's going to use this. So, but what's really helpful is just going out, talking to people and trying to understand what happens, right? So posting on LinkedIn, going to like messaging journalists, looking at who has reported on previous elections and messaging them and trying to understand if they'll give you some time of the day, just to really understand what their process looks like and what some of the challenges are and where we could help as a data team. And then from a design perspective, we looked at what historically has been done. So this is an example of what historical kind of elections maps look like. And we did a couple of different like user studies where we looked at how voters were interacting with the historical elections maps. And we asked them like, what were some of the challenges that they faced? What were some of the things that they hope to see and how they would want to interact with this? And from there, we learned a lot around like, okay, map interactions, how users actually wanted to interact with the data and what kind of questions they wanted to get answered. We spoke to the media agencies and the journalists, as I mentioned. So as I mentioned, we looked at previous elections, so 5 years ago. We looked at who these journalists were, and then we just messaged them and we were like, hey, we saw that you guys covered the previous elections. Will you guys be covering the upcoming elections, or do you know who will be doing that? And most of the times they were pretty happy and friendly to speak with us, and that was like super helpful for us as well. And I think one of the value propositions that we had is like we are somewhat a neutral platform. So focusing just on the data and being very careful about not biasing the narrative of the election, because it tends to be quite a sensitive topic. So that was one of the major considerations that we had as well. So when you go into it, there's really a lot of different types of information across the elections. So designing what is important to show and the information hierarchy is super important. These are like some of the examples that we looked at. So we did a lot of research around how other countries did visualize their elections. This is an example from New York, and a lot of this kind of like visualizations and interactions. And then we took a lot of inspiration from this to decide what we wanted to do on our side. So we started off with a couple of iterations, tested this with users, and got them to give us feedback around like how they wanted to look at the map, what were some of the things that they cared about, how would they want to visualize the results, and so on and so forth. And then eventually went a little bit deeper. And we noticed there were a couple of like clear problems. So in the elections, there are certain terms that tend to be pretty jargony, that voters are not super familiar with. So it's pretty important for us to try to keep things very clean, and also explain exactly what they're looking at. So for every single view that we had additional helper text or helper copy to help them understand what they're looking at. And we also had a glossary to go a lot more into detail. There were some like interactions that were pretty challenging for us to work on. So the first one was like thinking about how we wanted to embed the elections map into our partner media agencies' reports. So we're thinking of like, do we fix the height? Do we allow scrolling and so on? So these are some of the trade-offs that we had to make. So one of the things that we could do is like fix the height, but that means that you cut off some of the details. And then the alternative is allow users to scroll. But when you're on mobile, this becomes a little bit of a challenge. So for example, over here, you can see that as a user is scrolling down an article, they might end up scrolling on the map or on the embed. And this results in a very small kind of like touch surface. And they might run into a problem where they cannot escape from this view, right? And then finally, thinking about like mobile responsiveness and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of users in today's age generally consume media on mobile devices. So even though it's always easier to design for like desktops with like plenty of space, we had to think a lot about like how the elements would change when it moved onto a smaller screen, right? And I think when we looked at the data, about like 80% of users were coming in through mobile. So this was pretty much like the most important thing for us to do. Another thing that I kind of alluded to is like elections are super sensitive and colors mean a lot of things on maps. So we actually really deep dive into like what colors we should be using on the maps and how we should be representing specific political parties in a way that doesn't really bias people's perceptions of how we are showing the elections and also the narrative of the elections. So we looked at all colors across like different charts, and we tried to map them as much as possible to the party colors. But a lot of times there were multiple parties with the same colors, and it tends to be like red and blue and colors that people trust. So we had to make some choices around like the tone and the opacity of the colors as well. And this made it quite difficult in terms of like showing these kind of color gradients. So making sure that the color gradients didn't conflict with each other, and making sure that the colors were able to show the information as well. So the blue over here shows like the intensity of a certain election result, and also at the same time represents the party. So being able to like think of all these like color charts is pretty important. And then beyond that, there's also accessibility, right? So different people see colors in different ways. So testing it out on different types of color blindness was also really important for us, and just making sure like beyond the basic colors that we were looking at and assigning to the individual parties, we wanted to make sure it was accessible to people who are looking at the map as well. And then breaking it down into all the different views as well. So we had different types of views. And then we also had to pick different types of colors to represent what we were trying to show on these maps. So this is a basic color wheel that allowed us to show some of the information on the map. So things like boundary changes, winning margins, and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit on the design side and then super high level. On the engineering side, we actually iterated a lot. So maybe some of you guys have seen, you guys probably haven't seen the map, but I'm just gonna share a link on the chat to the map that you can see. So how many versions do you guys think we had from the very first iteration? I think I showed the very first prototype all the way to like production. Anyone wants to hazard a guess? 13 versions? Okay. That is very, very optimistic. I think you guys have very, very high expectations of our team. No, actually, I'm gonna show you. This is the Vercel that we use to like deploy and deploy the application, and this is the deployment configs, and we had 700 over deployments, and each of these is like an iteration over the previous map. And this is slightly outdated. I think the last time I checked, I think it's around 1,000. So every time we fix a small bug or made a small change the color, change the copy, we continue to improve the elections map and improve the product. And all of this comes back down to feedback from our users. So as we're building the map, we're constantly showing this to our users, we're constantly showing this to journalists, we're getting them in to tell us what they needed, what are some of their challenges. We looked at how they interacted with the map, and we constantly improved upon it. So it takes a lot of time and iteration to like polish what we thought was a pretty simple map. Um, but that's really kind of like the process. So this was the version 20 in terms of the deployments, version 50, 80, and then finally the version 761. So along the way, a lot of feedback also within the team in terms of like looking at the application. So if if you guys tend to be, I assume, working in technical teams, um, thinking about like changing small things each time instead of trying to make like big changes definitely helps a lot in terms of like keeping things within scope, and then making sure like information is not the interactions are cohesive. And also once the product is in production, users will start to have certain tendencies, right? They'll start to expect certain features in certain places, so you don't want to like move things around too drastically, or at least be gentle when you do that. Um, so there was a particularly interesting request that we got from media agencies, and this is something that we noticed. This is the map that they were embedding into their kind of like news articles. So they were actually very keen on differentiating their product or differentiating the embed from other media agencies. So one of the things that I learned as a team that we learned was that journalists and media agencies cared a lot about branding. Um, and they care a lot about using their brand colors or their brand copy. So it was kind of difficult for us to customize this for every single media agency, but there were some basic things that we could do, like allowing them to change the color. So if you guys play around on the link that I've shared, you can go to slash embed, and you can actually change a couple of things. So you can change the color and you can change the language. And the reason why we allow users to change the language is because in Singapore, we have four national languages: English, Mandarin, Tamil, and Malay. And there are certain media agencies that serve the specific demographic. So allowing them to represent the information in a specific language allowed us to share this data with basically all the major demographic groups in Singapore, which I thought was pretty cool. Yeah, so this is the happy part of the presentation. We got embedded on like 20 other media agencies like Bloomberg, I guess the international ones that people would recognize, Bloomberg, Yahoo, SCMP, and so on and so forth. In a span of like 2-3 months, we had 5 million visitors, and for a country of 6 million people, that's pretty impressive, pretty cool. Yeah, so people are really excited about being able to view the live election results, being able to see the boundary changes over time, and being able to search for their own electoral boundaries, their own constituencies, and figuring out where to vote. And I think one of the interesting things was also being able to see the changes in election performance over time or over the various elections. So this is the fun part, I think. A couple of hiccups and learnings across the entire process. So I'll go through each of them and kind of like what we learned. So when we first launched, we had tested our application with maybe like 100x traffic based on like what we had estimated. But when we first launched and the electoral boundaries were first released, our traffic actually like spiked 1,000x. And that actually resulted in a couple of rate limiting errors. I think emailed Marina super panicky one day, and I was like, "Hey, we're running into rate limit errors. I need your help. Please help me." And that was not a great day for me. but we ran into this issue and we had some degradation in terms of services for about 4% of the visitors, which was obviously not great, especially on launch day. So a lot of like our media agency partners were messaging us, and we had to handle that situation. And then the other two things were pretty specific to mapping and specific perhaps to elections, right? So when we had tested this out, the way the elections work in Singapore is like the electoral boundaries are released to the entire public at the same time on the same day. So as a team, we didn't get the data ahead of time from the public. We got it maybe like half an hour before. So we had to set up the map and then share this to the public at the same time as when the entire country was receiving the maps. And that meant it was quite challenging for us to test every single geopoint and geocode on the map. And there were some postal codes that were mapped about 30 meters off, 30 to 50 meters off the actual location. But what this meant was it could mean that this specific postal code was on one side of the road or the other side. And as you can imagine, with electoral boundaries, they're mostly drawn around the roads. So if you're on one side of the road, you could belong to constituency A. If you're on the other side of the road, you could belong in constituency B. So when we first launched, we actually didn't realize that this was an issue until I think some of the voters started messaging in and said like, hey, like there's some kind of incongruencies in terms of like the constituencies that are being shown on this map. Yeah. So we're pretty lucky that there were people looking at it on the first day. So it allowed us to catch this pretty quick. But it just kind of shows you like how challenging it is. Like just a 30-meter difference that is pretty much impossible to spot by the naked eye makes such a big difference, especially in this use case. And then finally, there were some like missing postal codes as well. So Mapbox had a list of postal codes, but then other kind of like platforms had another list of postal codes, and these postal codes were like not really aligned as well. And it's just really challenging to kind of wrangle all that data. And this is also partially on us because we are supposed to be Singapore's data team, and we are supposed to have all the postal codes, but we had multiple different sources with multiple different types of postal codes, which meant we had to match all of these together. And that's pretty challenging because postal codes change over time as buildings are built and buildings are destroyed and so on and so forth. So this was just like a really interesting time for really good trial by fire when we first launched the map. And I realized like our team realized like there were some postal codes that were missing or outdated, and we had to really quickly kind of like update that on our side as well. So some of the learnings here, definitely test everything as much as you can and way beyond like what you expect. Oftentimes you might think who's gonna look at something that you have built, but surprisingly people do. And then always validate and cross-check data. I think the challenge with data is that data is always changing, and data freshness is always a major problem. So when we actually went to check with the elections department, it turns out that they had collected their postal codes in March of that year, and then they released the boundaries in the middle of March. So it was maybe like a 2-week gap, but even in that time, there were changes in postal codes that resulted in some of these problems. So even though we had tested this ahead of time, because the data is constantly changing, data freshness and data quality is always a problem. We always had to play catch up and always had to like make sure that this was fine. So there are some things that we could have done better, but this is some of the things that we did. So, just being very clear about the issues that you run into. So the moment we had problems, we put up a banner, we notify our users, we tell everyone, is one of the things that is pretty uncomfortable. I think when you are going into production and having problems, no one really likes to share mistakes publicly. But that really helped us to retain trust with some of our users. Just like having a clear communication around what we were trying to do, what we were fixing, how we were going about solving the problem, and making sure this didn't happen anymore after the first day. So yeah, that's a very quick kind of like overview of the project. Hopefully everyone has had some interesting learnings from this. So in terms of what's next for like the open data portal, we are looking very heavily into data freshness, coming off some of the learnings that we had on the elections data, and then focusing a lot into real-time APIs, so things like floods, and showing like real-time weather alerts on the platform, as well as like integrating into a lot of applications. And I think one of the biggest things that we're trying to close is how can we incentivize government agencies to share data or improve the quality of data. Yep. So that's where I'll kind of like pause. Of course, if anyone's like interested to ask more questions or reach out to us, you can find us on Telegram or email us at admin@data.gov.sg. But yeah, maybe I think we have 2-3 minutes, so happy to take any questions and see if there's anything I can share really quickly.
Thank you so much, Foong. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for sharing such frank and insightful reflections on your process and your learnings as a team. I remember emailing back and forth with you during the project, and it's great to actually kind of see the full story of it as well. Congratulations. Definitely election maps are a high stake thing to just kind of roll out as your first interactive map project. So yeah, lots of congratulations coming in the chat. I guess just one follow-up question that I see here about the missing or incorrect postal code data. So given that you're the open data team for the government, after discovering these issues, is there work being done to improve the consistency of postal code data?
Yeah, we work pretty closely with the kind of like the Singapore land authorities on like the geospatial data. And we're starting to realize that there's actually a lot more problems than we originally thought, in terms of like when the data is updated, right? So whenever new postal codes are registered or they're being changed, there's a little bit of a lag time between when that happens, and when that is made available, as like open data. And this lag time is a challenge because when there's a lag time, people start to work on like different versions of the same data set. And that's when you have issues in terms of like routing, navigation, and stuff like that. So that's an active problem that we're trying to work on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, welcome to the world of geospatial. It's great to have you part of the Mapbox community. We are at time, so I've got to cut us off, but thank you again for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.